disappointing for the Conservative Party, who you would expect to show some leadership on this issue. In the last couple of years, they've become part of the problem.
Hello and welcome to Offscript. My name is Steven Edginton. Britain faces an inflationary crisis not seen for more than 30 years. Inflation is due to hit 7% this spring, with energy prices soaring and the government whacking up taxes across the board of the entire economy. So why is inflation rising so quickly? Is it here to stay? Who is to blame and how do we get out of this economic disaster? To discuss the state of the British economy, I'm joined by the financial journalist and author Matthew Lynn. Thank you, Matt, for joining us. What is currently causing the inflation crisis?
That's a big question. I mean, I think there's probably two big things causing the inflation crisis, and it's not just a UK problem. I mean, we feel it in the UK, but it's very much a global problem. And actually, one thing that's worth noting is that unlike the other great, most recent inflation, not that recent anymore, the 1970s, early 1980s, the UK is actually probably slightly behind the rest of the world. We got slightly lower inflation than the United States, actually slightly lower than Germany. So we have a long history of being one of the worst countries in the world for inflation, and we may well get there. We can talk about that in a minute, but at the moment we're not too bad. So I mean, I think the first thing to say is that it's a global phenomenon, and you're seeing really two things coming together. I mean, we've had a decade of printing money on an unprecedented scale. We started after the financial crash in 2008, 2009. Lots of people started warning about inflation, but it didn't actually.
We've got a visitor. We've got an inflationary visitor.
Got my cat. Sorry about this. My cat is worried about inflation, but. Yeah. We all video. My cat will get more traffic than me talking about economics. That's for sure. We'll get her views in a minute. She's mostly worried about the cost of coca. Leaving that aside, obviously we had money printing on an unprecedented scale, and there's a lot of economic history that tells us that in certain circumstances that does lead to inflation. And then we had the pandemic. We ramped up. The extent to which we were printing money, but we also contracted supply. We know about that. We were all at home. We were locked down. The shops were shut. The restaurants were shut. You couldn't buy stuff. There was no shortage. So when you have a lot more money and when you have a lot less supply, prices are going to go up. I mean, that's right. That's right in the economic textbooks. Lesson one.
So, like your cat, inflation is going to keep coming back.
My cat is going to keep coming back. I don't put it on YouTube. It's going to get too many hits.
Well, listen, we should be turning the question around the other way, really, because over the last decade, as you say, we've been printing money, we've been using QE, we've been expanding the monetary supply. So why hasn't inflation really increased until now?
Absolutely. I think that's a fair question, and I think one angle of that is it kind of lulled us into a slightly false sense of security. Lots of people around 2010, 2011, were worried about inflation taking off, and we saw governments in this country. George Osborne and David Cameron came into government. They talked a lot about austerity and balancing the books. People were worried about it. Mervyn King, as governor of the Bank of England, used to kind of worry about it. Look, I think the answer to the question is that economics is not a precise science. It's not engineering. You can't just press a button and say that'll happen. In 2 years' time. It'd be good if it was that simple. But there's so many factors coming together, and the global economy is so complex that you get all kinds of time lags. So you had countervailing forces for quite a lot of time. I mean, you did have a collapse in demand, obviously, after the global crash. So that, that some of the money printing was making up for that. You had a we had banks that went bust and a lot of money kind of disappeared. So we were plugging the holes there. And actually some of the QE was justified from that. And look, I mean, we could probably talk about that for a long time. And I think, in the economics departments, Oxford and Cambridge and Harvard and MIT and the rest are going to be studying this for 50 years and, kind of scratching their head and doing the graphs and the charts and trying to work out exactly what was going on. But I think, the simple answer to your question is that, it takes time and there are countervailing forces. And I think we became a little bit too complacent after the financial crash, and we thought, oh, this is great, we can just print money. Wow, that's really good. We just asked the Bank of England to, give us another 100 billion. And then Rishi Sunak can turn up on TV saying, oh, you can all be paid for staying at home and it'll be good. But actually what we're seeing now is just those kind of basic laws of economics reasserting themselves. So when you create a lot more money and when you restrict supply, and I think the big thing that happened in the pandemic was we restricted supply at the same time, then the only real way for a free market economy to kind of fix that, to bring those two things together, the amount of money and the amount of stuff, is for prices to go up, and that's what we're seeing now. And what we have to be worried about and careful about is whether we can control that, whether we can get that back on track, or whether we get back into some kind of we get back into a very, very nasty kind of inflationary spiral.
Well, we will get on to that in a moment, but I'm still keen to talk about this period, this extraordinary period, as you say, people are going to be studying it for a long time, where we expanded the monetary supply, yet inflation remained low. And one of the reasons that people say that happened was because of globalization, and you also link it to sort of shrinking in demand after the financial crisis. How does globalization link into all of this inflation at the moment? So the argument is that by having cheap labour and by exporting our sort of manufacturing overseas, we've been living on borrowed time in terms of inflation.
Yeah, I think that's a lot. I think that's a lot. There's a lot of truth in that. As I was saying a moment ago, we had the kind of increasing the money supply, but we had countervailing forces. So we were kind of pushing inflation on with one button, and we were kind of reducing inflation a little bit with the other one. And globalization was doing that. So we had a lot of cheap manufacturing, particularly from China and other places in the Far East, coming out, and that helped to depress prices down. So we kind of got away with it. And then obviously when the pandemic came along, a lot of those supply chains became disrupted. I mean, I don't think it's 100% the case that. I don't think it's 100% the case that we were living on borrowed time. We had kind of one-off gains. Globalization is good. Globalization does make stuff cheaper, and it's more efficient. And it's more efficient to outsource stuff and to have supply chains from around the world and to manufacture things where it costs less to do them. So that's not really kind of living on borrowed time. That's just capitalism working. It's figuring out how to make stuff in a cheaper way and provide it to people all over the place. So that was a good thing. But, I kind of come back to a point, I think possibly even before the pandemic, we were reaching the limits of that, that we'd kind of banked all those gains. There may be some gains to be had from it, but not a huge amount more to do that. And some of them were starting to go into reverse. So labour costs in countries like China, Vietnam, and Thailand and elsewhere were starting to go up, and that's good. It's good that people in other countries start earning the same amount as people in this country or France or Germany are used to earning. But it makes stuff a little bit more expensive, and it equalises things out, and that was probably always going to happen. So I think we've kind of already reached a lot of the end of a lot of those gains. And the pandemic accelerated and exposed a lot of that. And, now we're probably going to have to figure out how to increase productivity in this country. And that's going to be a bit harder, come to think of it.
Of course, whilst retail prices remained low after in the last decade, asset prices have continued to rise. If you look at house prices, for example, this has seen an extraordinary rise in terms of house prices. Have we ignored the inflation in asset prices to our detriment in the last decade?
I think so. Certainly lots of people were saying, and I probably wrote about it, and lots of other people wrote about it when people said, well, there's no inflation because of the money printing, so try buying a house, and then or try buying some Apple shares. And then it's not so clear that there's no inflation. So there were other prices going up very rapidly. To say we ignored it is probably an exaggeration. I don't think people in the financial media ignored it. I don't think people in the city ignored it. I don't think central bankers ignored it. It was there in the Fed reports and the Bank of England reports. I guess the difficulty was what were you supposed to do about it? You can't really put up interest rates to try and control the price of Apple shares. Maybe Apple shares are higher because Apple's everyone loves iPhones and they make great stuff. So there's all kinds of reasons for it. House prices, again, it was a little hard to say because, in this country we have, probably the world's most dysfunctional housing market, probably the most dysfunctional housing market that's ever been created in the history of the universe. And that's a particular problem that we could talk about for an hour or two if we wanted to, and how we solve that. But I think, I guess I'd make 2 points about that is that, absolutely, asset prices were a kind of signal that something was going on. That inflation was there. It hadn't fed through into what you were paying for, beer down the local pub or a pizza at Pizza Express, or what you were paying for, clothes, when you go shopping in the high street or that kind of thing. But that was possibly on the way. And it was also impacting living standards. If you wanted to buy a house, most people want to buy a house. It's something most people aspire to. It was getting harder and harder to afford if you wanted to have investments to save for a pension. And again, that's something most people aspire to. You're having to pay more and more to buy any kind of, reasonable equities or bonds. So absolutely, that was something that was there, and sooner or later it was quite possibly going to cross over into consumer prices, and that's what we're seeing now.
Have politicians become complacent to these warning signs? Because there were some economists and some people warning that a huge inflationary crisis was coming because of all the reasons that we've laid out, the sort of easy credit, the QE, the expansionary policies the governments around the world have been pursuing. And there's this idea that a sort of monetary establishment, as it were, of policymakers, people in the Treasury, Bank of England, even politicians, said, no, this isn't going to happen. Inflation basically doesn't exist anymore. We can get through this crisis. We can get through this. There isn't going to be a crisis. Do you think that people have been complacent over the last decade? Yeah,
I think they definitely have been complacent. I mean, people have been warning about it. But I think we got away with it for a little bit. And the truth is, it's phenomenally tempting if you're in government, isn't it? I mean, the magic money tree. That's a kind of a glib phrase, and it's a little bit more complex than that. But there's when we call it the magic money tree, there's sort of an element of truth in it. And if you're a finance minister, it doesn't matter whether it's in this country or a different country. If you're a finance minister, or a minister for education, or a minister for health, or prime minister or president, you start seeing this stuff and you're thinking, raising taxes to pay for stuff, that's hard. The focus groups don't really like it. I've got an election coming up, but apparently we could just print the money. And it seems to be okay. You kind of do it a little nervously at once. It's the crack cocaine of public life. You do it. You have a little sniff. You have one go. I'm not an expert on that, but apparently that's how it goes. Sooner or later, you try it again and again, and you make it bigger and bigger and bigger because it's so easy. And it's partly complacency, but it's partly just the temptation of it. That it's the easy thing to do, and we can pass the buck everywhere as electorates. Where electorates really clamoring out for politicians saying, hey, it's not that easy. We shouldn't be spending so much on healthcare. We should be charging you £10 a time to visit your GP. Were we really asking for that? The truth is we weren't. When they told us that they could increase public spending without having to increase our taxes, we were like, okay, we like the side of that, and we voted for it. So there's complacency and blame everywhere. But I suppose the important thing, at this juncture, is that people kind of get a little bit of people get a grip. We're not in a hyperinflationary situation yet. We've got a spike in inflation. We're up to 5.4%. The Bank of England is projecting that we'll go above 7% as they are in the United States at some point this year. But the really important thing, I guess, is that we actually think, yikes, there's some history books there. We know that that's not a good place to go, that we can bring it back under control, and that we don't get into the place where it's very, very painful. Because, you certainly got there in the 70s and you needed deep recessions. You needed deep recessions and very, very high unemployment to bring it under control. We don't want to get that if we can avoid it.
Before we get into the future and how to control this current inflationary crisis, worse than 30 years, this is a significant event at the moment anyway, and also for millions of people across the country. They're seeing their energy bills go up, they're seeing national insurance go up. This is going to be a real sort of squeeze in your pocket. But before we get on to the solutions, I do want to open the history books, as you say. And first of all, we'll go back to Gordon Brown when he was Chancellor, and then we'll go back even further than that. You can mention the 70s as a great example. So Gordon Brown, do you think he basically has won the economic argument in terms of Brownite economics? Despite Labour losing that election in 2010, in all but name, they've remained in power in terms of monetary policy.
Yes, I think that's true. I mean, we're still living, in a kind of Gordon Brown's world. We kicked back against it for a while, I mean, I have an unpopular view, which I throw out occasionally, that, we underrated George Osborne as a chancellor, not as a human being, possibly, because nobody ever really liked him very much. But as a chancellor, he actually did some quite good things. He was possibly, of the last 8 or 9 chancellors, probably quite high up there, and he did try and control public spending, and he did make significant inroads. Not really cutting public spending; that's virtually impossible. Almost even Mrs. Thatcher didn't manage to cut public spending. It's kind of off the scale, difficult in a modern democracy. But just by controlling spending, by keeping it, what the left really attacked everyone for, austerity, which wasn't really austerity. It was just saying we're not going to spend quite as much more every year as we used to. Just by controlling it and letting the economy grow, he reduced the state spending as a percentage of GDP, and he also cut taxes quite significantly, and cut taxes in quite an intelligent way. But we've lost that. I mean, ever since the referendum, ironically, we've gone straight back to a kind of Brownite world. It's kind of Brownism, Brexit plus Brownism. Both start with a B. There's a little bit of alliteration. I might use that in a column one day. We've gone straight back. We were fundamentally in that world where, spending is always just reclassified as investment. Public spending by itself is considered a good thing. And the more public spending you have, and the more taxation you have, the better it is for the economy. And unfortunately, it's fundamentally wrong. But that's the intellectual and political world that we live in. And possibly until that starts to change and starts to unravel, then it's going to be very difficult.
Let's open the history book and take our viewers, our listeners, back to the post-war consensus. So this is the 1950s, the 1960s, and obviously the crisis hits us in the 1970s. Can you describe the sort of economic policies of those governments, those consistent sort of Conservative and Labour governments, who basically decided that they would have a hugely interventionist economy, we would sort of have quasi-socialism, they had prices and incomes policies. What was going on there that managed to lead to this terrible inflationary disaster in the 1970s?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, it was pretty much, what we've seen in the last five to 10 years, and what we see at the moment. It was a very dogmatic insistence of a kind of, what we call Brownism now, but was called Buscalism in those days. That was the kind of post-war Keynesian consensus was a bigger state was better, that higher taxes were better, that higher welfare spending was better, that the government could manage the economy. And we possibly haven't quite got to that bit yet, but we're getting quite close. They thought, but certainly when Gordon Brown used to talk about abolishing boom and bust, he was close to that. There was a very sort of arrogant post-war Keynesian belief that a bunch of planners in Whitehall or in the Fed or the Bundesbank or whichever government they were operating out of could tweak the economy a little bit here. They could press this lever over here. They could just pull on the brake a little bit over here. They could engineer full employment. They could engineer growth. And then it came unstuck. The spending, very similar today. The spending just escalated and escalated. You have particular causes, but there's always particular causes. In particular, in the 60s, you had the Vietnam War, which was very, very expensive for the United States. You had the social programs in the United States. And the world, I mean, there was a slight difference in that the world was much more a dollar standard. You had fixed exchange rates. So without trying to get too technical, that does make a little bit of a difference. But that broke down because of the cost. It became too heavy for governments for the American government to support it. Richard Nixon kind of broke the gold standard and the dollar standard. And then you had the oil crisis. The oil crisis came along. Hey, so does that remind us of anything? There was suddenly a shortage of energy. I mean, it was a different trigger, because it was war in the Middle East and we were dependent upon oil in those days. But now we have the net zero stuff. We have a shortage of gas. We have, President Putin in Russia meddling around with the gas supply. So it was a different set of geopolitical circumstances. It was a different trigger. But the setup was worryingly similar. That you had, sort of 10 to 15 years of a very arrogant policy establishment that thought it could control the economy. It thought it was smarter than it really was, and thought that it could create a lot more money, that it could engineer full employment, that it could engineer growth through that. And then a trigger came along, and that sparked the inflationary spiral. And then it was really, really hard work to bring it under control, and it was painful.
I'm reading a lot about this post-war period at the moment. I think it's absolutely fascinating. And one of the interesting parallels I think I'm seeing to today is this idea, perhaps it's less so now, but this idea that they were sort of blaming the British public for inflation. They said, well, you're demanding huge wage increases, you're putting up prices, you're being unpatriotic by doing these things. And the government, through the prices and incomes policies, throughout the 60s and the early 70s, they attempted to control people's wages, and they attempted to do that by businesses basically reporting how much they were putting up prices, how much they were putting up wages, and the government were telling them, no, you should be doing it by X amount or Y amount to make the economy efficient and to control inflation. Now, recently, we've seen the governor of the Bank of England tell people to not ask for pay rises. Now, he's putting the onus of inflation again onto those people who are demanding pay rises quite justifiably. Huge inflation, energy prices going up, taxes going up. Governor of Bank of England, I think he's on hundreds of thousands of pounds in terms of salary himself. I think he's doing all right. He doesn't need a pay rise. Do you see some extraordinary parallels between the attitudes of those kind of economic elites back then and to today?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, hopefully by force of argument, we'll do our best at the Telegraph and a few other places to try and inject some modicum of common sense and history into this argument. But absolutely, you're right. I mean, you're starting to see it. I mean, you saw it from Andrew Bailey the other day, popping up saying, "Oh, you should forego wage increases." It's actually started in the United States, and we could talk about this in a minute. The Biden team is a big part of the problem. I mean, that if we think our government's a bit loose on monetary policy, just take a look at what they're up to in the United States. They are off the scale wild. But some of the kind of people behind Biden have started talking about wages policy and incomes policy. They're kind of dusting it off and saying, "Oh, it wasn't so bad, was it?" Here's an interesting little chart that we've got that shows that actually it can work. And you're kind of thinking, even Paul Krugman in the New York Times the other day, he was a very left-wing economist, big Democratic supporter, was saying, "Oh, no, please," to his own people on his own side, saying, we shouldn't be going there. Prices and incomes policy is a catastrophe. It doesn't work. But that's where you start, and it's not hard to understand, is it? Because if you come out of this, if you think back to, even Richard Nixon, Richard Nixon wasn't a left winger by anyone's standards, but he introduced, wages and prices controls in the United States. That's pretty. It's hard in a way to imagine. That it was that state controlled in what's supposed to be the most free market economy in the world. And obviously in this country, we used to have a minister for prices. I think it was Shirley Williams, possibly. It was kind of like her job was, if you wanted to put up the price of a loaf of Hovis, you had to go to the ministry and say, well, we're thinking of putting another 4p on it, and then they'd have a committee, and the trade unions would come in, and good grief, it really didn't work. You can't, but you can see intellectually where it comes from. Once you get into this mindset that the government can control the economy, then you think, oh, bother, we've got inflation. So rather than doing the difficult thing, we could talk about that in a moment, which is actually controlling the money supply, having more competition. That's a great way to control inflation. Break up monopolies, restrict the size of the state. These are the things, we took us about 10, 12 years last time around to get round to them. Hopefully it's not going to take that long this time. But, people will get into this mindset that, why don't we just control wages? And very soon they'll be saying, well, why don't we just control prices? We're already seeing it a little bit in energy, aren't we? There's lots of reasons we can talk about in a moment why energy prices are going up, but you can't just control the price. You can't just go along to the energy suppliers and say, we're going to half the price. When the wholesale gas price has gone through the roof. I mean, they've done that in France. France, a more stated country than ours. They just said, we'll halve. I think it knocked. It's an €8 billion bill for EDF, which is also one of the major energy suppliers in this country, and the share price, collapsed on day one, and the boss of EDF was saying, where are we supposed to find €8 billion from? You can't just mandate prices. You've actually got to fix the real problem. But you can see that, for governments that have got into that mindset, it's the next lever that they go to, but it makes the problem much worse, which is why I guess we've got to start, talking about it and arguing about it now, because, we could just repeat the whole of the 1970s and early 80s. We could have 10, 12 years of chaos sorting out this problem, or we could do it in 1 or 2 years. And it'd be a lot better if we did that.
Well, this is the key, isn't it? And I really want to get into, before we get on to today, I want to stick in the 1970s just because it's such an interesting example of what happens when inflation gets out of control. So in 1973, as you say quite rightly, there is an oil shock, price shock, and oil prices massively increase. This causes particular problems in Britain, and for the next decade or so, we are in a terrible, terrible economic situation. Now, I didn't live through the 70s. When I speak to my parents about it, they talk about sort of having to work by candlelight, and the lights are going out, and it was the 3-day week and all these things. Can you describe to viewers, perhaps who have never experienced such a time of inflation, what that was like? What was the economic crisis like for working people at the time? What happened in the 70s that was so disastrous?
Yeah, I think it was tough. I mean, I'm a bit older than you. I was very young in the 70s. I was still in primary school, but I can just about remember it. I can just about remember. The lights went out the TV went off at 10 o'clock. I think I was supposed to be in bed, but I wasn't always. With schools were restricted hours. There were rolling power cuts. That was partly the miners' strike, but if you get back into it, the miners' strike was caused mainly by the inflationary problems. I think it was a grim time. Some great music and some good fashion, but that was about it. And it was tough. And I think we've forgotten a lot of that. That it was, inflation is very, very harsh on ordinary working people. It's fine. It's not so bad for people who are asset rich. It's not so bad for people. It's okay sometimes better for people in the public sector, but not always. Their wages don't keep up with inflation. It becomes just a real struggle, and we haven't been in that kind of place for a long time. Money starts to lose its meaning. I think we got up at the peak to 26, 27% annual inflation in the two big spikes in the sort of early and then the late 70s, and it causes very rapidly falling living standards. But also, I think and Hayek writes about this very well. Who was one of the great sort of gurus of kind of anti-inflationary economics. It causes a sense of dislocation. Just kind of prices, they have a kind of function in society. They're partly just about buying stuff and selling stuff and moving things around, but they sort of anchor you. You have an idea in your mind that things cost so much, and suddenly they cost a whole lot more, and you have an idea in your mind that your wage or your salary buys a certain amount of stuff, and you have a certain living standard, and suddenly it all evaporates. It creates a sense of kind of fluidity and political chaos and economic chaos. I mean, it's very damaging for society. Coming back to what we were talking about earlier, I think people have been, because it's been a long time. People don't have that long memories. People have kind of forgotten how difficult it is and being complacent about it.
And what's also worrying is that during that crisis in the 70s, instead of turning to the economics that we would aspire to, the sort of free market economics. At the beginning, we turned to Labour in 1974. I mean, the Conservatives were a huge reason that this crisis happened, obviously. But the government, or the British people, turned to Labour, and they elected a Labour government. And in many ways, the Labour government made the crisis worse. The trade unions were striking, etc., and this caused the winter of discontent in 1979. This huge, sort of zenith, if you like, of the entire economic crisis of the 70s. And of course, Mrs. Thatcher comes along, and there's even more problems in the early 80s, but eventually it gets sorted out. And as you say, it took a long time for this inflationary crisis to come under control. What's interesting is that in response to inflation, governments and, let's be honest, sometimes the public can look for the easy answers or the short-term solutions. I mean, for example, today that Labour are talking a lot about a windfall tax on BP and Shell's profits, which have been significant because of the rise in fuel, in rise in gas prices, for example. Yet they ignore the fact that last year they made huge losses because of the pandemic. And perhaps a windfall tax could increase inflation, energy inflation, even further. So is there a danger that people are simply going to short-termist, easy solutions when we need to be looking at those hard but realistic solutions?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in a sense, that's what we've been doing for the last decade. We've been looking for the easy, short-term solutions, and unfortunately, there's probably not much reason to expect us to change now. That would be asking a lot of human character, particularly, I think, when there's so little leadership. And it's disappointing for the Conservative Party, who you would expect to show some leadership on this issue. That when they in the last couple of years they've become part of the problem. I mean, that's the harsh truth. The Labour Party, we don't, on kind of controlling inflation and fiscal responsibility, we don't have great expectations of the Labour Party, and that's lucky because we're going to be disappointed. They're going to reach for the easy solutions. They're going to do what the French do. They're going to do windfall taxes. They're going to do price controls. I mean, we're already seeing the energy market, the energy price cap. Ed Miliband, thanks very much. It was a bad idea. Windfall taxes are a bad idea. They contribute to inflation. They destroy profits, but actually, what they really do is they destroy investment. So, if you take the energy market, for example, we have particular problems. Aside from all the money printing, we have particular problems in the energy market, which we could talk about. But the way we get out of it is by more investment. And you could be green or less green. If you want to have more wind power, because the wind's a bit more variable than we expected, that's part of the problem. But you could just build more capacity. Be a bit more expensive. Other people I'd probably advocate, and there's some movement on this, just opening up the North Sea a little bit more, possibly opening fracking, and you could get more as a kind of stopgap energy. But, either way, if you want to be more extreme green about it, you could have just more of those wind farms in the North Sea, and that would give you the electricity at slightly higher cost. But the companies need the profits to do it. If you take all the money off the windfall taxes, they can't go. They're expensive, those wind farms. They can't. They can go. You see them sometimes. You think, wow, that looks like a pricey piece of kit. So we're going to reach for the wrong solutions, populist, short-termist solutions, and I think. I think what we really need in this debate, what to make a real change, and I can't see it coming from Boris. I mean, the truth is, it's just not in his makeup or his character. It's actually some kind of leadership. I don't, I'm an optimist. I try to be optimistic. I think the public would be open to it. I think there would be a certain, maybe not a majority. Hopefully a majority, but certainly big chunks of the public. If you said to them, people aren't stupid. If you said to them, look, remember the 70s. If you're not old enough to remember the 70s, ask your dad, ask your mum what it was like going down to Tesco when inflation, when prices went up to 27. Ask your gran if she's the only person who can remember it in your family. Get a grip on the situation. I think if you had that kind of leadership and people saying, look, we can't go for the easy answers. We're going to have to kind of rein back a little bit on spending. We're going to have a bit more competition. We might have to moderate wages. You might have a 2 or 3% drop in living standards over 2 or 3 years. And there'll be a little bit of pain. You might see interest rates go up a bit, but that's going to be much better than the kind of 20% drop in living standards that you might see 3 or 4 years down the road. Whether that's a majority position, heck, who knows? I don't know. Get a focus group. But I think there would be an audience for it, but we're just not seeing that kind of leadership at the moment, are we? We're not seeing people going out and putting that message across.
This is the interesting thing, isn't it? That there are so few politicians in the Conservative Party who are arguing for this in public. I mean, maybe in private there are many Conservative MPs who are unhappy about this. And even despite Boris Johnson's woes, it seems that there, as you say, no one's making this argument in a sort of forceful way, in a public way. Perhaps there are, some good ones. Steve Baker, he was on this podcast a few weeks ago making these points. So, all the kudos to him for doing that. In terms of the Prime Minister, you mentioned Boris Johnson's leadership. Is this the worst Prime Minister we could possibly have in an inflationary crisis? Because he's such a big spender. That's what he loves to do. He loves these huge infrastructure projects. He can't say no. He doesn't like disappointing people. Public spending cuts are sort of the complete anathema to his entire political ethos or ideology if he has one. So is he sort of the worst Prime Minister we could have at this moment?
Oh, but we could have Jeremy Corbyn, I suppose. So if you look at the two choices that were available to us in 2019, he was possibly the second worst, which may be why people went for him. I mean, I don't think maybe Jezza would have been better in this situation than Jezza and John McDonnell. It's hard to imagine, but they couldn't have been a lot worse. No, I mean you're absolutely right. It would be hard to have anybody much worse. He doesn't seem to have the interest in telling people, home truths, giving slightly tougher messages, being a bit more grown up and being a bit more realistic to it. I mean, it just doesn't appear to be in his nature. We're just not seeing any signs of it. I mean, I'm sure he could if he could. I mean, he's a good communicator. And, I guess people would understand if Boris said we had to tighten up. I hope he tightened his belt a little bit. But, he might be able to get the message across because, they know that he doesn't want to do that. They know that he's not, it's kind of Mr. Hair Shirt. He's not, he likes us all to have a good time. So possibly he could possibly be, a decent conveyor of that message, but he just doesn't show any interest. And possibly the ship has sailed. I think probably the ship has sailed now. He might have been able to do it 6 months ago, but it's hard to see him doing it now. To get that message across might well have to be a different Conservative leader.
One of Boris's great obsessions during his Prime Minister, or his premiership rather, has been net zero. And this has been, I would say, one of his two flagship policies. We've got net zero and we've got levelling up. In a way, both of them could be argued to be inflationary. Let's stick with net zero, though, because this goes to the energy crisis we currently have. £700 energy bills are going up this year. Huge problem for many families around the country. In fact, for everyone, I think. How does net zero impact energy inflation?
It's impacted it quite a lot. I mean, we've shifted to, we've shifted towards renewables. The basic story is that we didn't have enough. We overestimated how effective that would be. We overestimated how quickly it could be done. We've moved too far and too quickly, and we didn't put in enough gas. As I think everybody's starting to accept now, so we didn't put in enough. Gas is the kind of intermediate energy source until you get to the kind of promised land of cheap and reliable and plentiful wind and solar power, which is not unimaginable. I mean, you will get there. In a little while, but it's going to take a little bit longer than we think. We ran down our domestic gas industry. That was a huge mistake. We introduced price caps and controls which deterred investment. We stopped people investing in the North Sea. And we put what effectively a ban on fracking. We have huge amounts of shale gas in this country. A lot of it up around County Durham, tends to be where the coal was. A lot of it around County Durham, that part. A lot of it in the southeast, actually, around Tunbridge, where there's a stretch from Tunbridge Wells to Guildford, which you don't really think of as kind of energy town. People might object around those leafy suburbs to have people fracking in the back garden, but maybe not. But we've stopped all that. So if you look at the American energy price, it's hardly moved. The natural gas price in America is just like, it's a really dull chart. It just goes like that in a straight line. That's because they have fracking and we don't. And as prices have gone up a little bit, the frackers have just produced a little bit more because, hey, they can make some money at it. That's how a free market works. So a lot of it's self-inflicted. And obviously, the final part of that story is we've handed a huge amount of power to Vladimir Putin because he's the swing producer in Europe. We don't actually consume a lot of Russian gas, but we import a lot of gas, liquefied gas on tankers, and that's set in the global market, and demand for that's gone through the roof because of the problems of Russian supply. So it's directly linked to the green policies across Europe. But it's a self-inflicted wound. We don't have to be doing that. It's poor planning, and that energy price, increase, which is like fivefold across Europe in natural gas. Is a trigger, just like in the 70s, going back to what we were talking about earlier. You can have all of these conditions, and then you just need like a little spark, sets it off. And spark can come from anywhere. In this case, it's coming from the gas price, and it's self-inflicted. And it comes back in a way to what we were talking about, much earlier in this conversation. Is this kind of very arrogant policy elite? They think that government's much more powerful than it really is. One of the key lessons that we learned in the 70s, intellectually, people like Hayek and Milton Friedman, which Mrs. Thatcher brought into government, was just this realization that the government doesn't know that much. It's that lovely Ronald Reagan quote about, the scariest sentence in the English language: I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And the government spent a lot of time being here to help. They've tried to manipulate the energy market. They've tried to control the energy market. They've tried, they put all these plans in place and it's all gone a bit off the rails. It's all gone wrong. And that's not an accident. It's not an accident that happens. Most of the stuff the government does goes wrong, and that's why intellectually 30, 40 years ago people came to let's try and have a bit less government. Let's try and get the government to do a bit less, be a bit less, assume that it doesn't know very much, assume that stuff goes wrong, step back and let the markets work instead. But, jeepers, we're a long way from that position intellectually at the moment, aren't we?
I'm going to put the government's case for their economy to you, and I want you to respond to it. Okay, so let's try and be fair to them in some ways. So they say that we have record investment in our NHS, as they would call it, in public services. They would say that the economy is bouncing back faster than most of the economies in the G7 from the pandemic. They would say that their furlough scheme was a massive success in saving British businesses. They would say from the disasters of lockdown, they would say that unemployment is still pretty low, and that living standards are rising, although there is this cost of living crisis coming this year, and they're trying to mitigate that with policies such as cutting council tax, and allegedly they call it a tax cut through the universal credit, the changes in universal credit as well. So this is their argument that in fact we're record investing in public services, the NHS. This is all really key. This is because of the pandemic. Inflation is an international problem, not just a British problem. It's not our fault. Just give us a few years and we'll sort it out.
Absolutely. It sounds a little bit like Gordon Brown, to be honest, but I think that's the problem. Look, it's not uniquely a British problem, and we've got good things happening in the economy, and we're not particularly in a worse position than France, Germany, or the United States, or several of our sort of main competitor countries. But we're also not in a better position, and I think we're ignoring the problems that are coming down the track. So I think inflation. If we come back to inflation, which is where we started, we're going to have quite significant falling living standards this year. If inflation gets up to 7.3, 7.4%, wages are currently rising at about 4%. The average person seeing a 3% cut in their living standards this year. We haven't seen that for a long time. Even in the crash of 2008, we worried about it, and we did see a fall in real wages, but it was very minor, and it was very temporary. So I think that's going to feed through to people's pockets quite soon. Then you see the second round effects of that. Once people's wages start falling, they spend less. inevitably they haven't got so much money. And then, demand for companies go down, at the margins some companies go bust. They can't afford the pay rises. If they have to push through the pay rises because inflation's going up, they have to cut back on the labor force, or they have to close some branches, or they have to cut some operations. I think what I'd say to that, it's okay at the moment, because you're at the very early stages of the problems, but the problems will get worse quite rapidly.
Rishi Sunak is responding to these problems by putting up taxes, and he would argue that he believes in sound money, that he's borrowed £400 billion to pay for the lockdowns and the pandemic and the furlough, and that it's quite right that we expect taxpayers to pay off all of that debt, and we shouldn't be putting the problem onto future generations through simply borrowing more money. And I know that you've argued recently against this rise in national insurance and against the rise in other taxes across the board, including corporation tax. So what do you say to this argument that, in fact, Rishi Sunak is simply believing in sound money, and he's trying to tackle inflation by putting up taxes and ensuring that we don't put off this problem to future generations?
Well, I think I'd say two things. I mean, a huge part of the tax increases are to pay for his neighbours' increased spending. So we don't need the increased spending. Obviously we had a whole bunch of emergency spending through the pandemic. And that was probably we could argue for a long time, and we'll discover, and we'll be studying it for a long time, whether it was really necessary, whether lockdown was really necessary. But let's let that go for the moment and assume that all that was necessary. So, but a lot of the spending since then has been voluntary. So a lot of the spending on levelling up, a lot of the spending on things like High Speed 2, a lot of the extra spending on the NHS. We have very, very poor productivity in healthcare. We just pump unbelievable sums of money into the NHS with no increases in productivity, with no improvements in standards. We're seeing that right across the board. So we could do. The tax increases are really to pay for the extra spending rather than to pay for the pandemic. I mean, I would. So that's the first point I'd make. The second point is I think we can. I do disagree slightly with the kind of sound money. We do need sound money. I think that's important. We can tolerate post-pandemic slightly higher levels of debt to GDP ratios. We're going to be at about 95% this year, up from about 85% debt to GDP ratio. Over the course of the pandemic, I think under 100%, it's probably fine. The markets will accept that. There won't be a revolt. I kind of have a key message, so long as we're less than France, which is not very hard as it happens, it's probably going to be okay. But, the third thing I'd point, which this government seems to have completely lost sight of, is just the importance of tax cuts as a way of boosting growth. Is that actually a lot of the tax, they've got to be a little bit bolder. And it was one of the things you learned in the 1980s, and Reagan was much better on it than Mr. Thatcher, actually, was that, if you cut taxes, you will be rewarded with stronger growth, and vice versa. When you put them up, you get lower growth. So I think that the corporation tax increase is a big mistake. We could be getting, a lot more investment, a lot more high-tech investment, a lot more productivity-enhancing investment with a lower corporation tax and more money. The increase in national insurance because it's taxing jobs is a mistake. So if we actually use the flexibility that we have and we're a little bit bolder, and there's lots of examples, I could run through them for you, where we have in the last decade cut taxes and been rewarded with increased revenues. And there's just lots of scope to do that. It takes a little bit of guts to do it. And you've got to kind of, fasten your seatbelt and think, okay, this is going to work. We're going to cut this tax, and 2 years down the road, I'm going to get more money in. But it's worked lots of places. And we are in a difficult position. It's worth taking a few risks.
On that second point, I just want to follow up on it. So you wrote recently in a Telegraph article something very similar to what you just said. So you said, true, there has been a steep increase in debt, and yet it is hardly calamitous. Even with a likely peak debt to GDP ratio of 110%, the UK is hardly out of line with comparable nations. France will hit 115%. Are you not just part of the problem in terms of causing inflation, this attitude of easy credit, easy borrowing, lots of borrowing over the last decade, as we've said throughout this interview, is perhaps leading to the exact inflationary crisis that we're seeing today? So by borrowing more and by allowing more borrowing to happen, you're simply going to be fueling more inflation. What do you say to that?
Well, it's a fair point, and it's a fair criticism. But I think the point that I try and make is that you have two types of borrowing. So you can have borrowing just to spend on unreformed public services, to spend on welfare payments, to spend on price controls, or you can actually have a slightly looser attitude to borrowing, which enhances growth. So I think if you have borrowing just to maybe postpone tax cuts, to postpone tax increases, so if you think we're going to relax the debt to GDP ratio, so we're going to not have the tax increases, we're going to let the private sector grow faster, I think you will actually be rewarded, and that was actually, it's an interesting split within the kind of general free market centre right. I'm much more on the kind of Reagan. If we go back to the 1980s as a comparison, I'm much more on the kind of Reagan. Cut taxes, liberate enterprise first, and if the deficit has to take a little bit of the strain, it will pay for itself. And Reagan was right about that. It did work. He had a lovely phrase. I don't worry about the deficit; it's big enough to look after itself, which was one of his kind of little jokes. But actually, that kind of approach did work, and I don't think you should let it rip out of control. I do think that we could come have a longer discussion about this. We will have lower interest rates and money is cheaper. I do think the kind of 70% debt to GDP ratio is a bit dated. I think you can go up to 100% without. I don't think that's really what's causing inflation. But if you use it to keep taxes under control, preferably to cut a few taxes, particularly the taxes on enterprise and investment, then you improve the productivity of the growth of the economy. You let the private sector get bigger. At the same time, you control public spending. Just control it, because you can't. You can try and cut it if you want, but good luck with that. In a modern democracy, it almost never works. But if you can keep it level and let the private sector get bigger, then actually the state as a percentage of GDP comes down. So listen, I'll take the criticism. I might be wrong, but I think if you use debt, the debt in that way, you're not stoking inflation. You're making the private sector bigger. It's a good distinction. I will concede you are taking a little bit of a risk.
It's a good distinction to make, though, isn't it? Because the government aren't increasing taxes to, I don't know, help the private sector or to help supply side economics. They are doing so to basically nationalise social care, to increase funding to the NHS.
Absolutely, so, they're just increasing state dependency. Absolutely. Yeah.
So let's
and they're shoveling vast quantities of money into the most inefficient. Let's be honest here, one of the most inefficient organisations mankind has ever created, otherwise known as the NHS.
Absolutely, and that could take a whole nother hour of podcast. I just want to finish this interview, though, on the solutions as you see it, and you've mentioned there one of them, cutting taxes, to this inflationary problem. What do you think we should be doing? We look back to the 1980s, you keep referring to that. That was the sort of solution, as it were, to the 1970s and all the problems we had in that post-war consensus. How do we tackle inflation in an honest and realistic way in the next few years?
I'd have two big elements, or possibly three big elements. One, I'd nudge interest rates up. Not catastrophically, but we have the lowest real interest rates, minus 5% or so, that ever witnessed in human history since records began. So I think we need to start nudging those up. We probably need to get up to 1.5 to 2. Would probably be about the right level at the moment. That's just going to ease things. That's going to dampen down the increase in the money supply. That's going to slightly put pressure on demand. I'd stabilise public spending. I wouldn't try and cut it at the moment, but I'd put it on a tight cap and limit the amount of increase. And I'd cut other taxes elsewhere to try and grow the private sector. And the third thing I'd do is I'd have more competition policy. Actually, the best way, we have a very complacent assumption that when costs go up, companies just pass on increased costs to consumers. But that depends on the market, doesn't it? If you're running the actual company, so Maybe we can do it. Maybe some other guy's going to come in and eat our lunch if we put up the price. So I think we should be, we haven't been tough enough on competition policy. We should be opening up more markets to more competitors. We should be making it easier for entrepreneurs to come into the market, and that will actually put downward pressure on prices much more effectively than anything the government do. And I think with those three points. You could actually control inflation, before it gets out of hand.
Thank you so much, Matthew, for joining us. I'm glad we ended it on the solutions and not the problems. I hope that we managed to get through this crisis.
Pleasure. Great talking to you.
Cheers.